Wavewalker sounds like a sailing book, but as clear as we're kind of talking, it's really a family drama. What happens if you basically lock a family in a small space for 10 years? Kind of what happens to those relationships? And that's what's really kind of fascinating.
Welcome to the Passages from the Heart podcast, a podcast made by an everyday sailor for everyday sailors. We talk everything from day sailing to racing to cruising to camping out on your boat and everything in between. It's time now to raise the sails. Welcome, sailors. In this podcast episode, I speak with an absolutely amazing sailor and woman, Suzanne Heywood, author of the international bestseller book titled Wavewalker, a memoir of breaking free. At the age of 7, with her family and a bare-bones crew, Suzanne departed Plymouth, England, for what turned out to be a 10-year odyssey of sailing throughout the world, aboard a 69-foot wooden schooner called Wavewalker. In this riveting, soulful conversation discussing not only the perils and adventures aboard Wavewalker, Suzanne also shares a heart-wrenching, epic saga detailing her coming of age whilst living at sea.
Hello.
Suzanne, hi.
How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I love your backdrop. You look like you're a kind of space person.
Yes, I should have something of my own sailboat. That would be probably more appropriate.
Yeah, no, that would be great.
Well, I'm just really thrilled to be able to get you on here. I recently finished reading the book, and
Wonderful.
the story it's hard to put it down. And the more I read, of course, the more you are immersed within the story, and I start to feel as if I am the person, I'm you, in other words, experiencing these things that you experience. And then it elicits a very emotional response within me. And so I was telling my husband before we were getting together here today, I hope I don't cry, because there are so many moments in the book where I did just that, because I can just feel as if I was right there experiencing these things that you're experiencing. I found this line that's actually on page 371, and it's of you having a conversation with a freckled boy, as you refer to him, named Max. And I believe that you were in Fiji at the time, and I don't remember or recall your age, but I'm sure you do. And what you said after he was telling you about being also a boat kid, I saw something that I recognized all too well: the fear of being trapped inside someone else's dream. I don't think you actually said that your father sailed prior to getting Wavewalker, but I could be wrong about that. So I was kind of curious about how his dream sort of blossomed, if you will, and to the point where he actually, you set off on this journey.
Wow. Yeah, so many things. So, I mean, first of all, I should say I've really thought a lot about the story, and I thought a lot about it when I was kind of writing it as well. And for sailors, it's not an anti-sailing story. Sailing is a wonderful thing, and I was very lucky to be able to do sailing. The issue was that, as you say, I was trapped inside my father's dream, and it was a very extreme voyage. It was a voyage that
Yes.
went on for 10 years. It was a voyage that meant that we went an extremely dangerous route, and were shipwrecked. It was a kind of voyage that meant that we couldn't get an education or have friends. We didn't sail with other boats. We didn't stop for very long. So it was a very extreme version that just didn't seem to take any account of the fact that they had children on board. And one of the reasons why I wanted to write the story is you do get this really strange disconnect between the moment I tell somebody, obviously a little bit less now because the book's become quite well known, but most of my life, I would say to somebody, when this topic came up, I grew up on a boat, and they would go, "That sounds amazing," and then I would feel obliged to say to them, "Well, actually, it was a bit mixed," was my standard phrase. There were good bits and bad bits, but I couldn't really get an education. I couldn't have friends, and they go, "Okay, I kind of get that." But the initial reaction was always the same. That sounds amazing. And that is a real issue for boat kids, and indeed kids who are taken in on other extreme adventures by their parents, because to other adults these things sound amazing. And for some kids, or done in the right sort of way, it can be amazing. But sadly, for you know many of them, it's not amazing, because these are dreams for adults, and these are dreams for adults that want to live in a particular sort of way, and they're not necessarily dreams for kids, and certainly not for all kids. And
Right.
that's the really kind of strange thing about the whole story, in a way, is that I'm very conscious that my father's dream may well be many other kind of adult dreams. But the fact of the matter it wasn't a dream that made any accommodation for children. And that's the whole kind of tension all the way through the book, the
Yeah.
fact that he will never accept that.
Yeah, and I have to say, I mean, I know when we initially were in touch, and you had asked about whether I had that ex-boat kid background, and I said, well, I am an ex-boat kid, but I was a weekending boat kid, not a live aboard. But I will tell you, sailing was also my father's dream, and so that's why we had boats, and every weekend, come heck or high water, that's what we did during the sailing season here where I grew up. And I was fortunate in that I, came to love the thing that my father loved. However, my younger sister, I have one sister who's almost 4 years my junior, and she didn't have that same sort of affinity for it. And I think a lot of it is what you experienced too. For example, Friends. I, for whatever reason, was lucky. There were a lot of kids my age that were also at the lake where I sailed, or I grew up sailing. But again, it was my father's dream, but I, interestingly, came to love it as well. My sister did not. And so she was the one who would sort of, I also remarked in your book how your mother always referred to you as Marty. Am I saying that right?
Yeah.
And I would say that's sort of how my sister was too. She just was like, oh, I really don't want to, I want to stay with my friends. And, so yeah, it is. I think that you and I are approximately the same age, if I recall reading your Wikipedia entry. And I think for us, at least here in the States, and I'm wondering if it was for the same for you in your area, about, what sort of, children really didn't have a lot of say, when we were growing up. I feel like kids today, I see it with my nieces and nephews, for example. They're now all grown adults, of course, but even so, they just seem like they had more to contribute to family decision making. And I remember my sister-in-law saying, well, what is there for the kids to do? If there's nothing for the kids to do, we're not going to do it. But for me, and probably for you, I don't think that we had that experience. It was, this is what we're doing, and you're going to either like it or you're just going to put up with it and be quiet. There was no, otherwise, I guess, is what I'm driving at.
Yeah, I mean, that's all really interesting observations. I mean, on the first one, the funny thing was, I actually liked sailing, and I think it kind of comes across in the book. Like, I was desperate to learn how to navigate. Actually, before I wrote the book, I went back and got my yacht master. And the only reason I could get my yacht master was because I'd been so determined on Wavewalker to teach myself how to sail. Partly because I'm afraid my father was very gendered, and being a boy and a girl, there was this whole thing going on about, my brother was a boy and he was going to sail, and, I was the girl and I was supposed to be down below cooking and cleaning. And I was rebelling against that. I wanted to sail. I didn't want to be down below cooking and cleaning, not least because my relationship with my mother kind of deteriorates, as you know, kind of about halfway through this voyage. So for me, it wasn't actually the sailing. I love the sailing. I think if I'd had your experience, I would have felt much like you. For me, it was the things that came with this very extreme voyage, which meant no friends, no schooling, nothing. And the increasing realization as I got older and you want a little bit more autonomy, that I didn't even have the kind of lack of autonomy that you would normally have. I mean, I just had literally no autonomy. I mean, I often didn't even know where we were going to go next on Wavewalker. My dad would
Yeah.
never tell us. He
And you
took
only had so much room on the boat to go, too. You were trapped.
Yeah, I had a bunk I often had to share with kind of grown male crew. The few times I had a tiny bit of money, my father kind of took it off me. So
Yes.
all those things rather than the sailing, where I actually think the sailing was not the issue. I mean, the funny thing about the story is if I said my dad had locked me up in a flat for 10 years, everybody would go, well, that's horrific.
Right.
But if you put it on a boat, it suddenly seems glamorous. But
Yeah.
actually, in some ways, it's not dissimilar. It wasn't the sailing that was the issue. It
Right.
was the nature of the voyage and the fact that the voyage didn't make any accommodation for that. The other really interesting thing about what you said is, and I've been talking to a lot of other boat kids as well, and one of the patterns that often seems to come out, so many interesting patterns, but a couple. One is there's often a big difference between what the parents say and what the kids are telling me, because quite a lot of these kids have parents who've written a version of the story. The kids' version is very different. But also this thing about two or more children on a boat and having very different experiences of it is very common.
Right.
The way in which it often plays out, if you've got a boy girl, is the boy becomes the good child and the girl becomes the bad child, because the boy, I think, it's more likely the boy is going to have a natural affiliation with sailing. It is quite a physical activity. Not to say that girls can't enjoy it at all, but if you've got a boy and a girl, I think it's more it does seem to kind of play out like that more often. Not all the time. At least one of the people who's contacted me, it went the other way, but the vast majority it went that way. And that's how it played out for me and my brother. He was the good child. He liked sailing. He liked being on this boat, whereas I increasingly wanted friends, wanted education, wanted some autonomy, and that was, not allowed. Your point about kind of parents, I mean, I agree. I think there has been a shift in the kind of expectation that parents have, that they need to accommodate a little bit what their children think. But I still think my parents were really extreme, even for their time. Now knowing, of course, I didn't know then, but now, of course, I know many people our age, and most of them will say, yes, of course, my parents, there's a limit to what I was allowed to decide. But, my
Right.
parents wouldn't just completely ignore my needs and wouldn't ignore my need for an education. They just wouldn't. So yes, it was kind of the time, but a very extreme version of that, I think.
Well, I thought it was kind of extraordinary that I thought you had mentioned in the book that your parents were teachers, but that they were so reluctant and just, you know, didn't seem to. I mean, I know you mentioned too, your mother would provide some worksheets for you and John, your brother, to work on, like during calmer times at sea and things. But I mean, the amount of, pleading, I would say, that you had to do with your mother and father, like whether it was getting to port on a certain time to make sure you could collect your papers from your teachers with the correspondence course, or even getting to sit for the exams. I think I think the engine had failed, and you were really concerned you wouldn't get back to sit for exams. I think for your junior certificate, maybe it might have been in Australia. And so it's just like this pulling teeth to get them to, you know, I mean, for me, it's like that's all my parents cared about is you better do well in school. And if you don't do well in school, there were consequences and all of this. But, I came to see your role on the ship as more a pair of hands. But in that particular setting, that, like you said, there was this shift. Once I think you guys got to Australia for the first time, and then you left from there to, I think, head to I can't remember. I think you were sailing for maybe Norfolk Island first, and then that didn't work out. Maybe ended up in Fiji. But I sort of saw this transition from being the child, who would play games with John, and to this now, you're older and mom wants you to help cook. Mom wants you to help clean. You have no choice. Your parents are forcing you to assume this role that is one that you really don't want to have.
No, I mean, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because you're right. Both my parents were teachers. I mean, my dad had not been a teacher for very long. He kind of did teacher training and hated it. So he only did it, I think, for kind of weeks. I mean, and then he kind of quit. My mother was a primary school teacher. But they didn't really, I mean, my dad never taught at all. I mean, he wanted nothing to do with it. I can't remember ever even having a kind of, I mean, I don't remember, he was supposed to be a maths and science teacher. I don't remember ever him being willing to talk to me about it in any way. My mother did give us worksheets to start off with when we first set sail, but it kind of stopped quite early on. Um, and I've been trying to kind of work out this as well, because it is really odd. But basically, my parents' philosophy, kind of put simply, was, their world was, what we were doing was my dad's dream. And my dad really, really wanted to do this. My mum was going along. My mum was very close to my father. And somebody has said to me, they gave me a kind of phrase, and I don't know where it kind of comes from, but the child of lovers is an orphan. And my parents, it was about them. It was about my father's dream and my mother with him being the center of attention, because my mother loved being the center of attention. And us kids were along for the ride. And they kind of liked us kids being along for the ride because we were pretty little kids and we kind of were quite clever. But they weren't going to do anything that meant that they had to sacrifice their needs. And of course, their needs were also the boat's needs because they became totally intertwined. Um, and therefore, at every moment, if you look at what they're deciding, it's not even so much that they're deciding against me. They're just always deciding to do the thing that is beneficial for them or for the boat, and never a decision that is kind of beneficial for me, even when the trade-offs are quite small. So, one of them I remember, and it's in the book, is we're in Malulabar, and I've just done the junior certificate that they barely bothered to get me to the exam for, and my school writes, because I actually got good marks, come down, you can meet your teachers. And it was only an hour's drive, and we had a car. And I was desperate to do it. I'd never met my teachers in person because I was trying to teach myself by post. And my father refuses because he said, no, no, we've got too much work to do on the boat. Because the boat and what they wanted always came first.
Yeah.
And at the time, I was disappointed, but not kind of angry. But actually, as a mother looking back, it's very funny kind of now look at, because as a child, you also accept how your parents are, because it's very hard to, you can't, I mean, what are you kind of comparing them against? But as a mother now, and I, as I was writing the book, I had kids a very similar age. I find it incomprehensible because, of course, I don't put all their needs, they don't trump every other need in the family, but it's
Right.
always a balance. My daughter will ask me for something, and like most kind of mothers, I'll go, yeah, okay, I'll do it. I'll compromise this, but you have to compromise this, and you will find a kind of way through. That was never the deal. So at every point in the book, when they do something that reads really oddly, if you look at it, they're just making a decision which prioritizes the boat and their needs over ours, apart from the very minimal to kind of keep us going. And therefore, your point about my role changed. Yes, as soon as I was old enough to be helpful to that kind of big project, cooking and cleaning and working for them as kind of basically kind of unpaid labor on
Yeah.
Wavewalker. That's what they wanted. And then, of course, my mother didn't really want me to study, because if I was studying, I wasn't working. And if I was
Right.
studying, I wasn't doing anything that was useful to them, really. How was that useful to them? It wasn't useful
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah. I can't, that would just be incredibly, well, frustrating is an understatement from your perspective. I was wondering too, as I was reading your book, you also talked about, there was a time when I think in the book where your mother says, I've had enough. And she goes to your quarters and says, Sue, get up, we're leaving. And then your parents, I guess you said they had had a heated argument prior to this happening. And then she was just, I don't remember how many years into the voyage that was, but I think it was some years into it. And I think to myself, because earlier in the book, you also had said, I think in reading her diaries, you had come, or maybe it was later, you had come to learn that she said she really didn't like sailing. And then so I got to wondering, I wonder if that's why maybe your mother had, uh, you know, she had to take it out on someone. Maybe there was this part of her that was very angry that she had to give up her party dresses. Because I remember you mentioned that in the book too, about how where will I wear my party dresses? And you know, she for all these years, as you were saying, had to put the boat first, and that meant she probably had to sacrifice part of the things she might have wanted to do with her life. So I wondered if maybe that's where some of that antagonism might have come from on her part to you. She's just taking it out on you because she can take it out on you. You know what I mean? There was probably the crew, probably she couldn't have done that too much because they were paying crew, right? And I remember you said that someone, even a guy named Alan, I think, had complained about her cooking, and then there was this big to do. And so, really, all of that anger she might have had and frustration about this lifestyle that she had to live because your father wanted to have this dream, you know, I think she really took it out on you.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of, I mean, Wavewalker sounds like a sailing book, but as clear as we're kind of talking, it's really a family drama. What happens if you basically lock a family in a small space for 10 years? Kind of what happens to those relationships? And that's what's really kind of fascinating. And why do people behave the way they do in that circumstance? It's really, really interesting. And of course, I don't really know the answer to why they did that. I mean, I've got all sorts of kind of hypotheses. I do think it's quite interesting reflecting now as an adult. I mean, so I wrote the book and I very deliberately tried to write the book. So exactly as you described at the start of this conversation, the reader kind of gets on board with me and I'm all excited and I'm a little girl of 7 and we're kind of setting off on this, what's supposed to be a kind of 3-year voyage, ends up being kind of 10 years. And you set sail with me, and it's all exciting. And then gradually kind of things happen kind of over time. And the reader kind of with me is discovering what this world is really like. And actually, I think by and large, the reader is ahead of me because, of course, I'm a little girl. So I'm actually not interpreting quite a lot of things in the way that an adult can interpret them. So things kind of happen. Like my mother, it's very, very early on, it's clear that she gets incredibly seasick and really hates sailing. To me as a little girl, I don't make much of that. But as an adult reader, you go, hang on a moment, this is very weird. You've just set off on a 3-year voyage and the wife hates sailing. That's just not, this is not a good
Yeah.
way to go. So but now kind of looking back on the whole thing, so I've written it like that so everybody can come with me on the voyage and kind of make their own kind of conclusions, and I've tried to kind of write it as fairly as I could. I think now looking back with the benefit of being an adult, I think my mother actually comes out of it possibly worse than is fair. uh I mean, I wrote her honestly. I mean, the things that she did were the things that she did. And if anything, I left a few of them out, so she absolutely was as horrible as that to me. However, what I didn't understand as a child, and therefore it's not in the book, is exactly what you're talking about, which is she didn't really want to be there. She hated sailing. She got terribly seasick. And what's happening, and you can kind of see this in the book to some extent, is over time, this boat is deteriorating.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have a lot of money. We were terribly badly shipwrecked quite early on. We've run out of money. We're taking these crew on board. So my mother's having to cook and clean. I'm being forced to cook and clean for hours each day for these crew. We're basically living in poverty. It doesn't look like poverty, but it really is. It's
Mm.
pretty miserable. And my mother's getting very tired. Um, so she behaves incredibly badly to me, and that's in the book. But she's in a funny sort of way, she is trapped, although she could have got out of it. That's the one thing I kind of pause and say, but she could have walked away, whereas I could not as a little girl or as a
Right.
woman. She had choice, I did not, and she didn't make that choice. And then I think my father, in a funny sort of way, comes out of it possibly slightly better than he deserves. Because of course, from little Suzanne's or little Sue's point of view, he was actually quite nice to me. When I wasn't asking him to do anything that meant that he had to make any sort of sacrifice whatsoever, if I
Right.
was going along with it, he'd play games. We married my teddy bears under the tree in Hawaii, and
I remember that. Yep.
yeah, and we kind of worked out the stars, and in retrospect, so long as I was playing along and I was not asking him to do anything that forced him to do any sort of sacrifice of what he wanted, he could be very charming. And so I grew up thinking my dad is convinced myself my dad was lovely, my mum was horrible. Actually, it was my dad who made this voyage happen. This was my dad's dream. It was my dad absolutely could have stopped it because it was him. Um, so it's quite interesting reflecting back. I mean, that again, that dynamic of the kind of the father usually who wants to sail and the mother who's dragged along and is quite miserable. I've had quite a lot of ex-boat kids, as I mentioned before, contact me, and that is also a dynamic that I'm hearing in many other stories.
Like very thematic. Yeah.
It's a very yes, and you can kind of see that now, not in every story, and it plays out in different ways, and not everybody's as horrible to their daughter as my mother was to me.
Right.
But that dynamic is definitely a kind of dynamic that you see. And I think people need to realize if they're going to put their family on a boat, they've got to keep on asking themselves whether this is their dream, clearly, because they're going to put their family on a boat. Is it everybody else's dream? And if it's not everybody else's dream, are the kind of compromises that can be made so everybody can enjoy it? Now, obviously, you can't, there's a limit to what you can do that, but at least kind of think about it. Because I
Right.
agree with you. I think my mother was increasingly miserable as time went on. And I think that was partly why she was taking things out on me. She was taking it out on me not because she blamed me, because she couldn't really blame me because there was nothing she could blame on me. I hadn't made her do anything. She couldn't tell me, my life had
Right.
been sacrificed for what they wanted. So how could she blame me? But she could, she saw me as a useful instrument to work. And she wanted me to be nice to her at all times. And if I didn't do those things, and she probably was quite miserable, she would then kind of lash out at me.
There was an incident, I think it was started with you objecting when you wanted to go on deck. And I don't remember, it was dad and mom that both said, no, you can't. And you just said, I'm going. And that there in the book, I think marked, at least for me as a reader, the moment when I saw, it was the first time that you challenged them, I believe, in the book. And then from there, you got a little bit more strength, to continue in certain moments, trying to get your parents to understand your point of view, not just saying, okay, I'll do that. No, I'm not going to do that. And I think you were probably, were you around 11 or 12 around that time when you I was trying
Yeah.
to,
It was kind of
yeah,
11 or 12 that I started to assert myself. And it's very
yes,
difficult when you're a child. So my brother effectively did what most children do with very dominant, dare I say it, probably deeply narcissistic parents, particularly when you're in a trap situation. My brother basically did, he was the good child, and also he was the boy. So, he was seen as being naturally the one who would be, on deck and doing all the fun stuff anyway. Whereas I eventually rebelled, and it was incredibly hard to do. Even now, I remember how frightening that was to do because you're basically challenging. I mean, when I went up on deck, because my parents always were both insisting that I stay down below and I cook and clean, and I was not allowed on deck to kind of change the sails. And this was such an extreme view that my father only had one set of child-size working life gear to work on deck. So we had safety ones, but you couldn't do anything if you put them on. So only one side, and it had been given to my brother. My brother wasn't relinquishing it, so I did not have safety gear to go on deck. And I eventually got to a point where I just thought, I'm not staying down below. I'm going to go up on deck, and I'm going to go up on deck with no safety gear. And I know I'm risking my life. I'm about 12 here. I'm not 6. I'm 12. I know, and I'm writing about this in my diary. Um, but my greatest fear was not that I was going to get swept overboard, although I knew that was a real chance because I was going up in a storm. It was that my father would hit me, that he would be physically violent to me. Because there was always a
right.
threat of physical violence from my father. He
I
never
wondered
hit,
about that. Yeah.
yeah, he never hit me. So to be really clear, he never hit me. It was
But he did
threatening.
hit John, though, right? You
He
talk
once
about how
hit
he
John. He hit
punched
John.
him.
He hit John and he hit other people. But he was
Oh,
a very so he hit somebody on the wharf, and and he grew up, he had a very tough childhood. So he was he could be a very physically aggressive man, particularly
mm,
when drunk. He never hit me. So but it was always there as a possibility. And I've tried to explain this to other people who don't have kind of parents like mine. It's very hard to explain. There were no boundaries, I always felt as a child. So if I really, really, really pushed my parents, they could have done, I felt, and maybe this is true or not true, I felt they could have done anything, you know, up to and including kind of dropping me off on an island and sailing away, which
They basically did that though.
yeah, they did that with some crew at one point, and they certainly dumped me on shore at one point when I was a teenager, which is
Right.
not in the book, and I was ashore for several
Oh,
hours. And by the way, that's quite dangerous. I was a very pretty kind of, slight kind of teenager, and
yeah.
just stuck on an island. This is not a good place to be on your own as a young
Right.
girl. And I knew that it was quite kind of frightening. So there was no boundary. So when I walked up on deck, when I climbed up on deck, my biggest fear was what my father was going to do, and that became a real confrontation. He kind of came up really close and stared, and then
Yeah.
eventually he backed away, and that gave me huge strength. I'd actually confronted him. I completely disobeyed him on something that he had demanded, and his power had somehow disappeared slightly because he hadn't been able to stop me. Up until that point,
Right.
he had total dominance on the boat. And at that point, I realized that I didn't have very much power, but there were some things where he was not able to stop me. There was some, but I was always very insecure because I never quite knew where that boundary would be and where he
Yeah.
would go. And of course, you're living on a boat. There's no rules. Nobody
Right.
happens. So
But there was a something that you had written about getting back to your dad and defying him. There was the time when you had the family vote, I believe in Hawaii, and it was, should we continue to the Pacific or should we go home to England? And so everybody votes, and I think it was 2-2. I think it must have been your brother, maybe said home, and you said home. And I guess your parents both said, let's continue on to Pacifics. And then I remember you wrote about how he said, this is I don't know if it was, I wrote it down in here somewhere, but I have something about, if I'm not verbatim, I'm sure, a benevolent dictatorship, and that as the captain, he has the deciding vote or something. So even though there was this, as a reader, again, you look at this as, oh, well, they're having a family vote. There's, that's the kids have a say. Well, that the first time I think it worked out where you all decided to, everybody had the same decision. But this time it was not that. But yet your dad was still putting the fist down. Doesn't matter. In a way, he's saying it doesn't matter what you think because I ultimately have the decision. It belongs to me.
yeah, for me, that is an absolutely critical moment in the story. Because if you think about it, we set sail when I was 7, and the promise was this was a 3-year voyage. I'd be back by the time I was 10. And by the way, this promise was also to my brother and my mother. I'd be back by the time I was 10. I'd go back to school. My friends would be waiting for me, my doll's house, my dog, everything. Um, by the time we get to Hawaii, not only have we been shipwrecked and we've almost died, but also we're now 4 years into this 3-year voyage. And the whole voyage has been predicated slightly on this idea that it's all of us choosing to do it. My father, I now realize, kind of both kind of gave absolutely no weight whatsoever to anybody else's view, whilst also liking to pretend that this was something that we were all doing together. And so I don't remember if we had a boat before we left England. I mean, I've been very little at that point. We certainly had a boat after the shipwreck to keep going, and all said that we would keep going. But I'm only 8 at that point. I mean, what do you do at 8? You don't really have a choice. And anyway, it's almost impossible to conceive of a world where you wouldn't do what your parents want you to do at 8 years old. But by the time we're in Hawaii, we're 4 years in, and I'm 11, 12, because we're in Hawaii for a while. And my father says, right, we're now going to make a decision. We're enjoying the sailing so much, we either kind of keep going or we go back. And I am desperate by this point to go back because I'm bored out of my head. My mother stopped teaching us years before. I'm trapped on the boat. My parents have refused to let me go to school in Hawaii. for all sorts of bizarre reasons, which I
Yeah.
now suspect are
I,
more about the fact they might have had to have paid for it because the reasons were just not
oh,
very kind of, yeah. It usually kind of came down to money one way or another.
yeah.
And so I'm bored. I don't have any friends. I really want to go home, kind of go to school, see my friends, and my relationship with my mother is starting to kind of really turn for the worse. She's
Yeah.
starting to call me names and not talk to me. So me and my brother vote, and my parents vote to keep going. And then, as you say, my father states it's not a democracy after all. This is a benevolent dictatorship, and I'm the captain. I get the final vote, and we're going to keep sailing. And that is a pivotal moment because at that moment, and it wasn't, I mean, I say it's a pivotal moment because at that moment, everything changed. It took me a while to realize that everything had changed, but everything had changed because from that moment, there was no even pretense I was on the boat through my own choice or even my own agreement. I've been
Mhm.
overruled. I'm effectively a prisoner on that boat from that point on.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it's never said like that because, there's a little bit of an assumption that as a child you go with it, but I'm effectively a prisoner. A prisoner on a boat with no schooling, no friends.
Yeah.
Um, and so it really is. I mean, it's back to this point of, it's all very well having your dream, but if you do have a responsibility as a parent, and
Right.
you have a responsibility you can't completely ignore. I mean, not only your children's wants, but also your children's needs. I mean, there are some
Right.
basic needs, kind of the, the Convention on Rights of Children include the right to an education and the
Well,
right to
I,
healthcare and all the rest of it, which were
yeah.
all completely ignored.
Well, and then I remember the foreshadowing, perhaps early in the story, when you talk about the first voyage from Plymouth down to, I guess, to Rio, and your mom is seasick, as you were mentioning earlier, for days. And I remember you were saying to your father, "But what will we eat?" And your father just says, "Here's a fruit cake." And I'm thinking, what is wrong with people? Like, you have to feed your children. Getting back to the abandonment thing, your parents decide to continue voyaging, but leave you and your brother in New Zealand. And I think you were 16 maybe or something. And I'm thinking, and you have to call the child line folks. I'm thinking, how are they even legally able to do that? Like to leave their teenage kids totally alone. I mean, not that you weren't capable, I'm not trying to say that you were, incapable of fending for yourself, but it's not appropriate. You're a child still, right? But they have you running the business ashore, booking
Yeah.
crew. And I'm just thinking, oh my goodness sakes, that's just,
Well,
I just, yeah,
yeah. I mean, it is extraordinary. I find it extraordinary, kind of looking back, how as a parent you could do that. So I was 16, my brother was 15. By this point, we've been on the boat for nine and a bit years. My brother had kind of given up doing any kind of education, so they put him into school in New Zealand. And the idea initially had been that my father would stay with my brother and me, and then basically
yeah,
at the last minute, my mother demanded that he keep sailing with her, and so he leaves, and we're left on our own in New Zealand. And it ends up being 9 months that we're on our own in New Zealand. And we don't know anybody. I mean, my brother's going to school. I'm still trying to teach myself, sitting in this little tiny hut that he'd rented, which, by the way, was totally unsuitable. I mean, it didn't really have any heating. I mean, it didn't have any
yeah.
washing facilities. I mean, it had a bathroom, but it didn't have a washing machine or anything like that. A
You were
completely
chopping wood to keep it warm, right?
I was chopping wood to try and kind of keep the house warm.
Yeah,
The only adult I knew was in New Zealand, which was hours of drive away, who I don't see, for months because she's just too far away. Um,
right.
and I sink into what I now realize is depression because I just can't cope. I can't cope with total isolation. I'm a 16-year-old girl. I'm very vulnerable too. I'm kind of it's not like I can wander around very much.
Right.
I have almost no money because my father left us almost no money. I'm trying to get myself into university. That's the only form of escape that I can see is to educate myself. I can't contact my parents, and then my visa keeps running out. And by the way, I'm sure the whole thing was totally illegal. But of course, who's going to, I mean, that's one of the other interesting things about this. Who is ever going to step in when, as a boat kid, you don't really belong anywhere? Yeah, so it
Right.
wasn't like I was a New Zealander in New Zealand. I was
Yeah.
always I was always just a nomad, so we were never owned by any country or scene. And so the only thing that New Zealand ever really cared about was my visa good or not. And my father would appear briefly the two times it almost ran out.
Yeah.
He managed to appear and then it got stamped and went on. So for me, that year was the worst year. And in the book, it's very dark. It gets very
It
dark.
is.
But then, as I say, the kind of worst bit comes before the end. I do get out of it.
Right.
And I never go back. I never go back. And it is amazing kind of looking back. I think because I basically bet everything on a one-way ticket back to the UK that I earned money to get. And looking back, I think kind of what a crazy bet to kind of do that. Kind of where did
Yeah.
that kind of come from? And it worked. But I mean, it could easily not have worked.
Well, there was somebody that was a mentor to you in the book, and I don't know if it was your biology teacher, Roger, or it was someone else, but somebody had said something to you about basically your, again, I'm not remembering verbatim, but alluding to your grit and determination, and that as a result of those traits of yours, that this person was confident that you would be successful. But, I think about just like even when you travel with Michael, the person who was formerly a crew member, and then you develop a relationship after you leave Wavewalker, and he ends up in England and you're in England, and you travel together I think you're 18 years old, and you're
Hmm.
traveling from England all the way back down and stopping at all these different places. And I'm thinking, my God, when I was 18 years old, my life was like so sheltered, and you just, you strike me as such a, maybe you didn't choose to be adventuresome, but I think that in the end that came out from within you, and that you became this worldly mature human being with this unique perspective on life. And so I often think too, with your own children, like if I had a parent like you, I would just be incredulous as to the life that you had led as a child, and even up until where you are right now in life. I mean, what do your kids think of all this? What did they think of the book once you completed it?
Well, I mean, well, first of all, I should say, so I was very worldly and I was very adventurous because the only way in which in the end I escaped was by, you know, finding my own route with
Right.
basically no support from my kind of parents. However, when I got to university, I discovered that I was missing so many things. I mean, particularly socially. It was really, really difficult socially. So I might have been mature, but I was missing so much. I was missing a lot of academic stuff, but I was missing even more the kind of social stuff. Um, it's funny, my kids have been very supportive of me writing the book. I mean, Wavewalker's always been there through their childhood as this kind of crazy story in the past. And they've been excited about the book coming out. They're very excited. I've optioned it for a mini series. They're quite excited about that. Yeah, very excited about
Yeah,
that.
I was
Um,
going to ask you about that, if there was something in the works in that line.
yeah. So
Yeah.
so we'll have to fingers crossed that's going to happen. But the funny thing, and they're now 22 and 20 and 20. They're in the midst of launching their own lives. And I sometimes joke with my friends, I think I'd have to jump naked off the Eiffel Tower for them to actually notice that I was doing something. So they're kind of supportive and they think it's kind of great, but that's occupying about 2% of their brain power.
Right.
98%, of course, being focused on university, first jobs, kind of their own kind of relationships and their friends and everything else. So no,
Right.
they're very supportive, but they're what's nice in a way is it's not a big thing for them. It's something that's happening. They're happy. They're happy that it's kind of out there and they find it a bit intriguing, but for them it's not a major issue. And it's always been there, you see, where they always knew about Wavewalker. In fact, you can imagine being, one of my children, maybe your kids are, you can imagine others in the same way. We would meet somebody new and we'd get to the point in the conversation where I would mention Wavewalker. This was before the book was published, and my kids would roll their eyes. Oh no, not the boat story. Because of course you'd start, and then it would be not an hour-long conversation, but there'd be a 5-6 minute conversation while people kind of ask the obvious kind of questions. So I think at least they feel now that the boat story, everybody now knows the boat story. So we don't have to explain it every time we meet somebody. So they're quite relieved about that. And they do say that as a parent, I'm remarkably unsympathetic about small ailments. It's like, you really cut your finger? Don't you realize that I had my head
Yeah. Oh
my
my
head
gosh.
fractured in the Indian Ocean?
That was just, I can't even imagine that. Every time you talked about going to have the operations.
That's somebody else who I think kind of comes out badly in the
Oh,
book, but I think everybody can kind of see through that, and that is the French doctor on our
yeah.
landing who operated on me.
Dr. Sen, how do you say Senra?
Dr.
How do you
Senelot. Dr.
Senra?
Senelot. Now, of course,
Yeah.
I saw him as this evil person, and I kind of
Yeah.
even describe in the book his smell and his hands and everything.
Yeah.
I mean, he was like, like this kind of evil childhood nightmare of a person. But of
Yeah.
course, the reality is, you know, looking through an adult's eyes, this poor doctor on this tiny, island in
Yeah.
space suddenly had this terribly injured little girl. He didn't
Right.
have any general anesthetic, so he had to operate on me without that.
I
It must
can't even
have been a
imagine.
horrendous thing for him to do. My
Ugh,
mother refused to come in because she
I
didn't like,
remember.
I mean,
Yeah.
I also, as an adult, I find, as a child, I just accepted it. As an adult looking back, I go, you know, how could you not go in? I mean, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, how could you not go in?
Wow.
And so I contacted Dr. Senlot when I was writing the book. He's kind of, as I say in the very end, I tracked a
Yeah.
lot of people down as I was writing the book. He's now kind of in the French countryside, kind of tending chickens, and we exchanged a few kind of emails. And I was able to thank him because I don't think I really thanked him at the time. I think I just
Right.
screamed at him continuously.
Let's shift over to some of the beautiful things about your experience with Wavewalker. First of all, one of the things I really love in your book, I love how you talked about different animals: Henry the whale, Claudia the monkey, Kelly the parrot, and then I love how you talked to Wavewalker. Like, it was just so touching. There was this line where you were, oh, I'm trying to oh, well, two powerful ones. I think this was after the incident of the wave where the boat gets damaged. I believe you're talking about, I woke again to the sound of Wavewalkers screaming, huge, wrenching cries of wood and metal tearing at each other. And then you have this other where you talk about, you say to her, this one, I want to cry. You said, don't worry, I'm here if you need me, I assured Wavewalker. But it didn't seem like she did. So in a way, you had this relationship, I feel, which it really comes out at the aftermath part of your section of your book, where you go to try to find her. And I can relate to that too, because I did the same thing. I tried to find my
Oh,
childhood sailing boat as well. Mine did not lead me to Fiji, but what an experience that must have been. And I don't want to give away, I don't want to be a what do they
ending.
call it? A spoil, yeah,
Spoiler
whatever.
alert. Spoiler
Yeah,
alert.
I don't want to give it away, but they're just some really tender moments in that section that I just really moved me. What are your thoughts on Wavewalker now? I mean, like, looking
Wavewalker.
back at that relationship that you had with her.
I think a lot of sailors probably kind of feel the same way. I mean, boats are, they're not like other inanimate objects. I mean, boats are, particularly if you live on a boat or you spend a lot of time with a boat, and particularly if you go through very scary situations with a boat. I mean, boats become, they become people, they become, you do kind of breathe life into them, say, we would talk about Wavewalker. My father, you would say, she's having a good day, or she doesn't like the sea, or, uh, and so in my head, because of course I'm a little girl on this boat and I grow up kind of almost inside Wavewalker. Wavewalker is kind of a person as well as a boat. And of course I know she's a boat, but And in retrospect, much more so than my parents. The Wavewalker is entirely loyal. Wavewalker never does anything, that's kind of disloyal or uncaring. Wavewalker always does her best. I always felt as a
You
little
can
girl.
depend on her.
You can depend on her. I mean, sometimes she can't manage.
Right.
Sometimes the sea is too much for her, but she's totally dependent. She won't kind of she won't tell you one thing and then do another. She won't pretend that something, my parents would do what we now know as gaslighting. They'll kind of tell you one thing, they'll deny that something happened, or they'll put their
Right.
own needs above yours. Wavewalker was, she was just in my world. She was almost maternal as a kind of,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, and so, yes, I did talk to Wavewalker quite a lot. And when she was injured after the wave, I mean, actually, when after the wave hits in the Indian Ocean, and I walk in, I did talk to her, and you could see the kind of sides coming in as, the sort of
Yeah,
like,
that was, oh, I remember that. That was
animal.
frightening.
Yeah, that was very frightening. And then, as you say, later on, I went back to look for her. And it's funny, before I started writing the boat, I hadn't really unpacked a lot of my emotions around my childhood. But by the time I went back to find Wavewalker, I had. And one of the things that I'd realized is I had to go and try and find out what had happened to her. And I felt
Right.
this incredible guilt that I'd never done that. Really, really guilty. Like the same sort of guilt you'd feel at abandoning a child or a parent or something.
Yeah.
So without kind of giving away the kind of spoiler, and by the way, there's still people trying to figure out what exactly has happened to Wavewalker. So there's another bit of that story still to be kind of figured out. But
Yeah.
yes, it's a very emotional relationship with Wavewalker, I think. And I separate Wavewalker in my head is different in my head as a child and still now is different to my parents. They're
Yeah.
not all the same. They are Wavewalker is a very kind of neutral, maternal, kind of caring.
Well, it's
Where
interesting that you say that because I heard a podcast once, a sailing podcast, and they were saying in the podcast that the reason why ships or boats are referred to as in the female is because they carry you to safety, like a mother would carry a child in her womb.
yeah,
And I just thought that was so beautiful because it does, I feel the same about my boat as a child and the boats that I have now. It's very much they take care of me and I take care of them sort of thing. Um, may I ask just one final question
yeah,
before
please
we sign
do.
off? If you could have added anything else to your story, what would it have been?
Wow. What I've added to the story.
Anything else
I
that
think
you,
when I was writing the story, um, I mean, I actually found it really difficult to write some of those experiences with my mother, and I ended up kind of putting enough in so people could really understand her. But I think if I was writing it now, I could be, maybe include even more of that. But I don't know. I think there's enough there that people kind of can see I think you've got is a very honest picture of kind of how it all was, I think. And I think I've had more time now since the book has come out to kind of reflect more. So I could probably put more, in the kind of podcast and so on, I've been able to kind of reflect more. But
yeah,
I was very lucky with writing Wavewalker because I started writing it in 2015 and then in 20 I was still, and it took me a long time just to put the facts together, a very
yeah,
long time. And I'm a very pedantic writer. um and then I had to stop writing it in 2017 because my husband fell ill and I ended up
yes,
writing his biography. So we worked together on it for a year and a half, and then I worked on it after he passed away. He worked for 5 different British prime ministers, so I published his biography. And then I came back to Wavewalker, and this is now, 2021, 2020, 2021. And there were two benefits of that. One is I'd become a better writer because I'd written a whole another book in the meantime, learned, kind of honed that a bit. The second thing is I could come back to Wavewalker with quite fresh eyes And
Yes.
actually and what I found is I was much more ruthless about what was I going to put in, what was I not going to put in. Because when you've just spent a lot of time writing something, it can sometimes be very hard to get rid of things. You've written this beautiful passage about, I remember I had a whole section on how we met a dugong in a harbour, in the
Yeah.
middle.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, dugong was wonderful. I thought the dugong was fantastic. Didn't add anything to the story at all. I'm afraid the dugong is gone. You won't find the dugong in Wavewalker, which is a little bit sad, but it didn't actually really help the story.
Well, there's a saying in writing that I heard, and it's called "kill your darlings."
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
guess that would be an example of it, because I thought about that when I heard that, and I'm like, oh, yeah. And as a writer, it's painful because, as you mentioned, that experience was a beautiful passage that you were writing about or had written about, but yet it didn't get into the book. So,
and the great thing about coming back to it cold, as it were, was they weren't my darlings anymore.
mm,
I had enough separation to kind of come
yeah,
back and think, okay, let's really think about the story of what's happening to these four people on this boat.
right.
You were on this
Yeah,
boat for almost 10 years as these children are going from, little kids into kind of almost adults. And and obviously I'm telling it through my eyes. They're the only eyes I can really kind of tell it through. But that's the interesting story, kind of what's happening, and trying to kind of tell people uh as clearly as I can kind of how that evolves so they can try and figure it out. And so in a funny sort of way, what I actually found is I ended up saying less when I came back to it because the
yeah.
story became kind of clearer.
Yeah, that's interesting. I like the idea of giving something the space and the time and then revisiting it later down the road. I think that's really, as a writer, a powerful writing tool. Wow. Suzanne, there's so many things I wish I could just ask you and just keep talking on and on about this. And I just am so incredibly grateful that you were willing to spend some time to chat with me about this.
It's been brilliant. I've really enjoyed it. So thank you
Well, I
so
have
much.
too. Well, it was wonderful meeting you and speaking with you. Thank you so much. And thank you for a wonderful story and sharing it with us.
Oh, thank you. It's been
Yeah.
fun.
I hope you enjoyed this episode featuring Suzanne Heywood, author of the international bestseller book Wavewalker, a memoir of breaking free. If you would like to learn more about Suzanne and Wavewalker, please be sure to visit Suzanne on her website, SuzanneHeywood.com. If you're enjoying my videos and new podcast series, please consider supporting a regular gal, me, along her journey of learning all things sailing by following my website, passagesfromtheheart.wordpress.com, and also by subscribing to this YouTube channel. Until next time, fair winds.